All right, Mike, you want to get started?
Sure. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start tonight's meeting to talk about our parking project, the county's parking project for Parking Reimagined. Just want to wish everyone a good evening and looking forward to talking to everyone about this project to reimagine parking in Fairfax County. I want to thank everyone who's attending tonight's town hall. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Supervisor Palchik is unable to join us tonight to host the town hall. However, her staff will be available to view a recording of this meeting and provide responses to the discussion if necessary. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Michael Davis, and I'm the project manager for this parking effort. In addition to county staff with you tonight, we also have members of our consultant team who will be providing information for this project later in this presentation. For the moment, I'm going to turn this over to Austin Gastrell, who will discuss how to interact with and respond to this presentation tonight. Austin?
Thanks, Mike. Good evening. Please keep all mics muted and cameras off unless you're speaking. Mics may be muted or unmuted using the mic button in the middle of your screen. To participate or ask a question, please raise your hand using the React button shown on the bottom right of your screen, and staff will call on you. If you do not see the React button, please use the meeting chat function to alert staff that you have a question, and someone will call on you. If you do not wish to speak but have a question, please leave your question in the chat box and staff will respond accordingly. If you're joining tonight via phone, please make staff aware that you have a question and someone will call on you. If you're joining tonight via public input, you may ask a question using the chat function shown on your screen or by calling 855-925-2801 and entering the code 7592 to leave us a voicemail. All voicemails and chats will be read aloud in this meeting. If you require translation services, please join this meeting using the public input link shared in the chat. Once in the public input link, you may click on the translation button on the top right of the screen to view closed captions of this meeting in your preferred language. Please note this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the Parking Reimagined webpage. Lastly, a link to a 10-question exit survey regarding tonight's town hall will be shared at the end of the meeting. Participation in the survey is greatly appreciated and will help staff to better understand and serve the community as a whole.
Thanks, Austin. Most people own one or more vehicles and take for granted that they will be able to park these vehicles in their travels. Most of the time, people don't generally think about parking unless they can't find a convenient spot or there is an unexpected number of vehicles parked near their home. Yet parking is everywhere around us. Most every land use in the county requires some parking. When people drive and park, they're focused on finding a convenient space. They don't often notice the gray empty edges that rarely have vehicles parked there. A key purpose of this project is to have people think about parking a little differently, to begin to think of it as a resource. And when you do that, you begin to consider the importance of that resource relative to other important elements that we all care about, such as the environment, affordability, and land design. When parking has a community value, then you can think about how that value should be weighed against other initiatives. Parking is a land use, just like residences, office buildings, and shopping centers. This project intends to imagine how best to utilize that resource. While the county is moving toward multimodal development that encourages more transportation options, such as walking, biking, and transit, driving is and will remain a common activity. This, of course, will require us to park these vehicles. Therefore, providing parking with land use activities will still be necessary. This project recognizes that parking will continue to be supplied. However, it's important that parking be sized to the average demand for it. The term that was created for this is right-sizing parking, which is to not underbuild or overbuild parking supply for a land use. While we strive to right-size parking and requirements, we also know there are places and uses that present parking challenges. This project will take in that information and look for ways to address those areas. Here I'll provide background information on some elements of parking that hopefully give some insight on the operation of and influences on parking and the role these play in considering changes to the requirements. Parking is a land use like your home, place of work, or where you shop. Parking has times of high and low demand. This can occur by the hour, day, month, or year. People know that during the holiday season, more people are out shopping, and this increases parking demand. In January and February, less people are shopping, and parking is freely available. While there can be times when it is difficult to find a parking space, parking should be constructed to address average demand. Within the county, there are places where you need a car for almost any activity beyond your home, and there are places where there are options that don't require a car. The character and location of a site can influence parking demand. In urbanized and higher density transit-oriented areas, options that allow less reliance on personal vehicles are available. It can even be possible to be car-free. This lowers the need for dedicated parking areas. Also, there are development areas known as mixed use that contain residences, places of work, shopping, and entertainment options. These types of combined uses can reduce the need for vehicle ownership for people who live and work there. Because the mixed-use area has these closely located options, residents or employees can walk or bike. As one potential result, residents in these areas may decide to only own one vehicle instead of two, which reduces overall parking demand. Because parking is a resource, it can be operated to enhance its value. An example of this is shared parking. Rather than building the minimum required parking for an apartment building, an office building, and a retail center located on the same site, the demand for each of those uses can be studied, and a smaller parking area can be built that provides enough parking for all these uses based on hourly demand. Looking now and toward the future, parking demand is changing with technology and people's behavior. Everyone's familiar with online ordering and home delivery of pretty much anything. This reduces parking demand when you don't have to go out to shop or eat. Also, even before COVID, remote working was growing annually. As we transition away from COVID, remote working is expected to continue to occur. These trends and other technologies to come will continue to influence the need for parking. Parking areas should be considered a resource to the entire community. It's land area that we have made a choice to use as parking. It could have been used for something else. When we consider the development of land, there are many elements that can be weighed, such as the environment, site design, and affordability. These are balanced with the need to provide parking, and sometimes the parking supply itself creates a need to address its effects, like stormwater runoff. Many times, the parking requirements for a site control how a site can be used. Questions we are asking with this project are the extent of parking's role in land use. How much parking do we really need? What are the trade-offs for less or more parking on a site? Where can we balance parking supply with other site use possibilities that will provide a community benefit? We want people to begin to think about priorities related to parking. Should a large amount of convenient parking be the ideal? Or can we think about balancing car parking against other desirable features, like a quality urban streetscape that is inviting to safely walk and bike? Or more open green space to enjoy cooling shade? Or maybe provide something that is more interesting than this gray area? Every change has a consequence. If we are to look at a current problem with parking supply, how could we address it? Adding more parking is a solution, but what effects might that have? In any land use option, parking becomes part of a cost-benefit decision. What are the ideals we should be considering when making these decisions? Looking at the photo in this slide, if we wanted to add more parking to address the high demand depicted here, do we want to remove those trees in the background to add it? Or would having those trees be important enough to tolerate this amount of parking demand for a few hours a day? These are among the questions we would like you to think about as you listen to and view our presentation tonight. We hope you'll consider this when engaging us over the next 18 months as we reimagine parking. Community engagement is a critical element of this project. We are seeking meaningful feedback from all elements of the community, including tonight's participants, who have personal experiences and thoughts about parking. But the community also includes business owners and tenants, land developers, nonprofit organizations, and religious assembly groups. Our engagement on this project will include those folks as well. We have learned during the pandemic that we can reach more members of the community with our tech resources. Nearly everyone has access to a smartphone, and many are able to participate electronically, which has opened new doors for remote and mobile participation and feedback. Our project website will be a robust resource for information to allow the community to participate and monitor the project's progress. We also have more traditional technologies, such as cable channel 16, to use for communication. We will engage as many community members as possible during this project. The project itself will last about 12 to 18 months. During this time, we will gather community feedback in 2 distinct stages, but always be open to receiving info and discussion. The first step starts tonight with this town hall to present our project and to begin to hear from you. The second will be when we take that feedback and develop proposals for your consideration. This will occur about halfway through the 18-month period. This project will focus on off-street parking and loading. We have 3 basic goals for this project: adding best practices and promising new ideas to operate parking now and in the future, increasing clarity and flexibility in the administrative language of the ordinance, which includes looking more at the context of a site or area to determine its parking needs, and streamlining parking review and approval, which includes increasing predictability of review processes, times, and outcomes. I'll now introduce Ian Banks, who's with our consulting team of Nelson Nygaard. He will provide background on their important role in this project and the activities they will be working on to support it. Ian?
Thanks, Mike. My name's Ian Banks. I'm a principal here at Nelson Nygaard in our Washington, D.C. office. We're a national transportation planning firm with about 150 staff, with about 8 offices around the country, both West and East Coast. And we're all working on creating more sustainable, equitable, and efficient transportation systems. I've been working in the field for approximately 20 years, including predominantly in the role of parking. Prior to coming to Nelson Nygaard, where I've been for the past 8 years, I was heading up the parking division in the city of Annapolis. So I'm acutely aware of how parking begins to play a role in site development, in economic vitality of downtowns and cities as a whole, as well as how it plays an important role within the community, and particularly in residential areas too. As Mike mentioned, our team is here to support staff in developing the recommended code changes to bring before the Board of Supervisors. You may well know that the parking elements of the code haven't received an overhaul since 1988. If you think back to 1988, our communities and economy are quite different from when from that time. Obviously, we can just consider just how the internet has changed since then. Travel has changed, deliveries, real-time transit information, these things called smartphones that we carry with us now as well. It's all changed how we travel and how we move around the world. Changes to the code can include a range of things that Mike described: minimum requirements, shared parking, changes to loading and queuing. And this work looks to the future. So how will new development happen? And ultimately, what we want it to be able to do is connect to your values and your community's values, as expressed through the county's comprehensive plan, the strategic plan, and other ongoing planning efforts around the county. Efficient and varied transportation options that are sustainable, safe, accessible, affordable, and ultimately equitable are what we're all trying to aim towards. And along with our partners at Clarion Associates, we as Nelson Nygaard will be undertaking a number of activities into support of this Parking Reimagined project. Our first steps are to focus on hearing from you, and under sort of events like this, the town hall, and in other ways that you're learning about tonight. In addition to sort of hearing about your experiences as it relates to parking, we're working on several other fronts. We understand how complex the Fairfax County development is. We know Tyson's is different from Reston, which is different from Springfield, and some of the less dense, almost rural areas of the county as well. We know that diverse places need carefully crafted solutions. So we're gathering local data, mostly from pre-COVID 2019 and earlier, but also some newer data to be able um, to understand how COVID has changed our travel patterns. And what we want to do with that is to actually understand what the current parking supply, demand, and impacts on our communities really are. At the same time, we're building an understanding of how other jurisdictions have modernised their parking requirements. So we're looking at places close to Fairfax County, so regional peers, as well as across the country. So how are some of the best parking regulations being brought to communities around the country? But we also want to learn from recent experience in Fairfax County as well. So how have recent development projects treated parking? How's the community, how have staff, and how have the board reacted to those developments, and how have they gone through that development process? So we're going to be able to complement that understanding with an evaluation of transportation and development trends. And how do we think that transportation and obviously in particular parking will begin to change in the next 10, 20, 30 years, not just related to the recovery from the COVID pandemic, but also into a future where perhaps um, travel patterns, the peak traffic is going to be lower as we begin to spread out our trips throughout the day, which is obviously an impact of perhaps an increase in flexible working hours and working patterns. Finally, we're going to be trying to develop proposed changes to the zoning code and obviously the administrative processes that go along with that. And so working closely with the staff that you've heard from tonight, as well as the community, will be ensuring that those recommendations connect to the values that we hear from these town halls and other public engagements moving forward. So we are going to move forward, and there's going to be a lot of other opportunities for you to actually be involved. And with that, I'll hand it back to Mike to share how that's going to happen. Mike.
Thank you very much, Ian. As Ian described, there's going to be a lot of effort to gather data, both from experience as well as from other jurisdictions. And that information, as well as the information that we are receiving from these town halls, will help us begin to prioritize and identify changes that we will want to be proposing with the parking project. We've begun our community town halls and more specific discussions with focus groups to gain background and perspectives on parking here in the county. As we proceed, we will continue to get critical input from all these sources of information and begin to develop proposed changes to the zoning ordinance. Once we have a proposal, then we will come back to the community to get their feedback on that. Then we will finalize our proposal for final consideration. We have a project website that will be continually updated with information and opportunities to participate in the Parking Reimagined project. I would like to remind you to complete the exit survey associated with this presentation, as it provides important background information for our project. I also remind you that this meeting is being recorded and will be available on the project website. We'll end our presentation with a few questions you might want to consider as you think about tonight's discussion. We hope this presentation helps you think about parking, or perhaps think about it in a different way. We encourage you to envision your perspective on parking and provide feedback to us, as it will help us define where we want to go for proposals to reimagine parking. Right now, I will open the floor to discussion, and Austin, I will turn it over to you to be kind of the moderator of the discussion going forward, but staff is available to answer questions, as well as take in information that you all will provide tonight in this meeting. And thank you very much again for your participation.
All right. Well, we will open the open forum portion of this conversation. So anyone that has any questions, as I mentioned earlier, you can either drop them in the chat on your screen. You can raise your hand using the raise your hand function, and staff will call upon you. So Some of the questions we are asking, as is shown on your screen. How does parking work for you in each of these places? So that would be where you live, work, and visit. What is most important to you in these places? Parking or the quality of the experience? Do you travel to and around these places by walking, biking, taking transit? What would be an acceptable substitute for a large amount of parking? And how do you think travel options and preferences will change in the next 20 years? Again, this is something that we're looking for as the future of the county. How can we look at our parking ordinance, or ordinance related to parking, to amend it for future uses and future trends? Again, you can raise your hand using the raise your hand function. You can drop a comment in the chat box and we will read it out and call on you. All right, DB. DB asks, will this initiative affect parking in older established neighborhoods? Mike?
Well, it could. One of the things that we have been looking at after getting some initial feedback is situations associated with older development, some of the older multifamily communities, as well as some of the older townhouse communities have, we've heard about potential overflow issues and things of that nature. The parking that was designed for those types of communities is, you know, didn't anticipate the number of vehicles perhaps that we are now seeing in those areas. But I think a lot of the focus of this project is going to be on higher density areas in the county, in the sense that there are a little bit more opportunities for transit-oriented development areas to take advantage of lower parking because of the synergies that we have within these areas, and the multimodal options that we have. So not that I won't say, I mean, part of this process at this point is to get feedback on all areas of the county to begin to develop proposals. But I don't know that it's going to have as much of an impact on lower density development as other areas of the county once we get to the point of making proposals.
Donna, I saw your hand was raised, and I just saw your comment about the survey having an error there. That should be it, and that should be working. I just checked on it today, so I'm unaware why maybe you're having that issue. Did you have a question besides that, or were you just wondering about the link as a whole?
Well, that was my first question. And if it's working now, I tried it, I think it was Friday, and I had an error message, but if it's working not now, that would be fine.
Yes, I believe it is.
Great. My second message is, you had talked about proposals to the zoning ordinance to change the zoning ordinance. If for certain types of future development, the zoning ordinance is changed to reduce the amount of parking, the minimum amount of parking required, is there also going to be a correlation in the zoning ordinance concerning like increasing the amount of green space?
I don't think it's something that we've thought of yet in a trade-off, but it's a very good idea, and it's an idea that definitely is something that, with a reduced amount of parking required, that it gives the opportunity to have more parking. Mike, would you like to take a shot at that, or Ian?
Well, I can go first if Ian has something that he wants to add. He can certainly feel free to join the conversation. One of the things that we're looking at as far as parking is concerned is kind of I mean, there could be some retroactive activities associated with changes to the ordinance, but for the most part, it's a forward-looking circumstance in the sense that as new development occurs or as changes in use occur, the new language, potentially new language in the ordinance would come into play in those conversations. And for example, a lot of development in the county goes through a zoning process. And in that zoning process, there are negotiations with the developer, and there are typically proffers or development conditions that are associated with those negotiations as it moves through the review process to planning commission and the board. And so if there are changes in the parking requirements that require less parking, then conceivably that offers opportunities to achieve some of these other values that we are looking for as part of this project. You know, it could offer opportunities to provide more affordable housing. It can provide opportunities to provide better site design. It can provide opportunities to address environmental concerns that the site may create. So that is one area of potential trade-off as you know, if we make changes to the ordinance for parking.
Okay, but it sounds like if changes are made and the amount of parking for future development is going to be reduced from what it currently is, it's kind of up in the air as to what that extra space is going to be used for.
I would say yes. I mean, it's part of, I mean, it's any circumstance that we have with land development in Fairfax County. We don't, at this point, we don't have a situation where we would have, you know, the ordinance would say, you know, relative to parking, the ordinance would say, okay, if you're going to reduce parking, you need to provide X. But that's one of the things that we're also looking at with regard to this project is, for example, transportation demand management, which is a program where you can create initiatives to reduce single occupancy vehicle driving or any vehicle travel in exchange for other use of other modes of transportation. So a lot of communities have as a part of their ordinance a parking reduction that's associated with transportation demand management. So if you commit to providing more bicycle facilities or car sharing or other types of amenities that would go into achieving the transportation demand management program associated with the development, then that is a mechanism to allow a parking reduction. So that's kind of gets to your comment. It's not necessarily an environmental one, but other things could potentially be built into the ordinance related to that. But that is one circumstance where there could be those values that come into the discussion and essentially credits associated with a parking reduction if the developer makes other commitments that are indicated in the ordinance.
Okay. So it does sound open-ended, like we could end up with fewer parking and more density as opposed to more green space. That's just, it doesn't sound like it's necessarily fewer parking and then better environmental uses or anything.
Well, it could be, I mean, there are a number of different values that could come into play with any particular development application. There are a number of different initiatives that the county has, and all of those come into discussion whenever, particularly we're looking at a rezoning case. And so from that point of view, it wouldn't necessarily be an environmental trade-off, but it could be some other community benefit that would be realized with the potential to reduce parking.
Okay, thank you.
And Donna, one real quick thing. If I just check the link again and it looks to be working, I would suggest copying the link and then dropping it into a different web browser and see if you can open it up that way.
Okay, great. Thank you.
DB, he says, I live in a 65-year-old single family housing development. With each house sold, it appears that there are more vehicles with the new owners. This includes work vehicles, trailers, and boats within the current law. So, FYI, parking on our neighborhood streets is starting to become an issue. That's something we're hearing commonly throughout this project. One thing I would note, and you talk about neighborhood streets and neighborhood roads, this project specifically being an off-street parking and loading standards. Um, I'm not sure if your neighborhood streets are public streets or private streets. My guess is that they're probably private streets. If they are public streets, Fairfax County Department of Transportation is currently going through a process to look at some on-street parking issues, and I would suggest that you possibly look into the Fairfax County Department of Transportation regulations regarding parking on street with those types of vehicles. But let Mike take a stab at your question here as it pertains to parking within neighborhoods if it's a private street or a private neighborhood.
Thanks, Austin. Well, as Austin had indicated, we do have. I mean, there's a distinction with our project as well as with between on-street and off-street parking. Our project is primarily focused on off-street parking, but we realize that there could be spillover parking on public streets, as well as privately maintained streets and that sort of thing. With regard to the public streets, our Fairfax County Department of Transportation is oversees on-street parking and on-street parking issues. So there could be remedies for that situation if it's public on-street parking that would be handled through our County Department of Transportation. For private streets, typically those can be regulated by the owner of the street. If you have a townhouse development, for example, that has streets within it to access the townhouse units, either the HOA, the homeowners association, or if it's a multifamily situation where you have a private street serving multifamily development, the owner of the multifamily buildings would have the first responsibility for managing those streets. So there are potentially remedies that could be worked through with either the HOA or the management company to address on-street or on-site problems that are created with parking. And hopefully that gets to your question a little bit better. Certainly, if you have a follow-up question, please share it with us.
All right. Does anyone else have a question? Again, you can raise your hand, you can put it in the chat. Someone will call on you, or we'll read it out aloud. Mike, anything you'd want to share?
I was trying to think if there was I was trying to think of if trying to stimulate a further thought from the audience about parking circumstances, and I'm wondering if people, Austin, you kind of alluded to it in your earlier comments. I'm wondering if people have any thoughts about what they think the future of parking is going to be relative to technology and travel options. If there's anyone out there who has any thoughts about what they think parking could become over time.
Yeah, and real quick, DB had asked, so this project is off-street parking and unloading is for malls, businesses, apartment buildings. It's a little confusing. So the answer to your question is yes, in a sense. I mean, all those things would be impacted by this project or something we're looking at. Neighborhoods are as well. New development. In new development, meaning that when someone comes in to build a new neighborhood, we could alter the rates, in the future for how many parking spaces are required for a single family detached, or attached home, or a new multifamily building. Um, a lot of times the issues with existing neighborhoods is that it's somewhat hard to change existing parking in existing neighborhoods. And so it's something we're cognizant of and looking at some. But to answer your question, yes, this is generally a project for off-street parking. So it's your parking for multifamily, it's parking for new developments, it's parking for a shopping center, your local grocery store, or your local places that you go to shop, eat, and recreate. And I also just put a link in the chat, DB, for FCDOT's parking restrictions and related issues. These have some interesting links to what FCDOT is currently doing with on-street parking. Anyone have any other thoughts or comments?
Donna Jacobson has a question about shared parking, and I can give a hopefully brief description of how that works. Um, Typically, shared parking, there are a couple of different circumstances where shared parking can occur. One, which was described a little bit in the presentation, is where you have a single site that has a number of different uses on the site. And if you have a mix of uses such as office, residential, entertainment, restaurants, retail, that sort of thing, each one of those uses has a general peak demand for parking. So typically, office would have a peak demand of parking in the middle of the day. Residential would have a peak demand of parking at late at night. And then the entertainment and retail options also have differing peaks that don't necessarily coincide with office and residential. So when you look at that site holistically, you can begin to decipher when these various uses have their peak demand and their lowest demand, and begin to design the parking for the site that would be less than the parts of the whole. So you can look at it as a situation where you can summarize the parking for all of the uses and be able to handle the parking demand for those uses with a smaller parking field because of the different peaks that occur amongst the various uses on the site. Another way of looking at shared parking is that would be considered on-site shared parking. You could have off-site shared parking amongst two or more private entities where you would have a similar situation. Let's say you have a restaurant, you have a parking area for the restaurant, and during the evenings, or particularly during weekend evenings, you have a lot of demand for parking, and it's beginning to exceed the parking supply. So in that case, you can create a valet parking situation or rent space offsite to allow patrons to park at an offsite location where the parking isn't being used, or it's not at it's a time whenever the demand for that parking is far less or almost non-existent relative to the use that's on the site. So those are a couple of different scenarios where you would look at shared parking as solving for a parking issue or reducing the amount of parking that you would need to build.
And one we see pretty often as well is places of worship. Just demand different times of the day, different days in the week where demand is of course increased. A Wednesday may be less busy than a Sunday for the Christian faith, or a Friday for the Muslim faith, and so that's something that we can look at those shared parking, requirement, those shared parking options to try to determine how can we effectively right size parking in these areas. But DB had a question. Said that he utilizes handicap parking spaces and was wondering if our project will take into consideration the growing baby boomers and the need for increased handicap parking. Mike, I'll let you take a stab at that and how the county regulates handicap parking and implements handicap parking.
Well, there's a minimum requirement for handicap parking based on the Virginia Uniform Building Code, and that is frequently referenced as a baseline to provide accessible parking. However, we are aware that accessibility is becoming a very critical issue in the county, not just with regard to parking, but with regard to some of the other elements that are associated with our project, in the sense of creating more pedestrian access, creating more pedestrian connectivity, and doing other things to increase the ability for people to move around throughout the county to get between sites and not be as reliant on personal vehicles. So there are a number of different initiatives going on right now in the county associated with that. There's Access Fairfax, which is primarily focused on pedestrian. There's also been some discussions with Planning Commission about increasing accessibility, and with the board as well. So that is becoming a critical issue. But looping back to parking, we need to keep in mind that accessibility needs to be a critical factor in design of parking. It's not necessarily related to the minimum parking that's provided, or changes that might occur with those types of requirements. But when we're looking at land use options, we need to be even more cognizant of where the accessible parking is located, perhaps trying to get more accessible parking on sites where we have that opportunity, and kind of focusing on making sure that we have our priorities together as far as looking at parking, trying to focus more on accessibility and making sure that there's an adequate amount of accessible parking, or even more adequate if needed, and locating that in the proper place so that people can access other pedestrian facilities within the site to get to other activities there. So it's a pretty big, it can be a kind of a broad circumstance with accessibility, but that's one of the things with this parking project that we can look at as we proceed.
All right, thanks, Mike. Donna asks, what type of development would be best for shared parking? Are there types of development where shared parking would not be a good idea?
I mean, I don't know that there's a specific development type or mix that would be not conducive to shared parking. But as far as something that's more conducive, if you have, as I outlined in the previous example, if you have uses that have really radically different peaking characteristics, that provides an opportunity to provide much less parking. For example, if you have a development that is just office and residential, that is the best scenario that you could have for shared parking, because the office peaks in the middle of the day and the residential peaks overnight. So you could almost, depending on the size of the development or the size of the uses in that development, you could almost share the same exact space. Like, you wouldn't have to build a lot of spaces for each of those individual uses. Some other sites, the more uses you have within the site, and perhaps different peaking characteristics, you might get less of a benefit from shared parking. But I wouldn't say, I mean, there are always opportunities for shared parking, you just have to look a little bit more closely at how the uses are going to operate on the site to make that determination. So I think there's always that, as I said, there's always that opportunity. It's just a matter of how much analysis and detail you have associated with the proposal.
So another example, I mentioned like religious assemblies and places of worship, based off of times of services. Another example would be when you've got a place of worship that has an associated school or childcare on site. Um, the idea of shared parking there is that we can park the site, for the shared uses instead of parking them for the separate uses as a whole. You're not going to need a parking requirement for, the same parking requirement for schools, a church, and a childcare on a site. Since those uses don't, some of them they semi overlap, but some of them don't overlap, we're able to actually kind of share that parking as a whole. For instance, school is not generally open on the weekends, and so that time frame is when a place of worship or a childcare may be able to use the parking and vice versa. All right. Does anyone have any other questions, comments, or thoughts about the project?
Ian, I was wondering if you might I'm not obligating you, but I didn't know if you had anything to share about shared parking or any other questions that were asked tonight. Kind of share your perspective on it, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in regards to shared parking, I mean, I think you and Austin did a great job in describing A, how that works, and B, what the sort of potential mix of uses there are. But I think that perhaps the additional item for shared parking is where some of those uses are essentially attracting the same customer as well. And so the more that you can have shared trips is important as well, and that comes back to making sure that perhaps the area where that person is visiting is walkable, and they don't necessarily have to drive from perhaps the bank to the place where they're going to grab lunch or back to the office. If it's a mix of uses there, someone can adequately just park at their office and go walk for lunch and do their errands at the same time. So that's another use of shared parking, as opposed to having to be disparate uses like you mentioned, whether or not it's a office during the day and residential at night. I think the potential of shared trips is important in that shared use of parking as well.
DB had a question, asked that if required parking, minimum required parking is lowered for an apartment building, is there a concern about parking overflow into neighborhoods? How will we prevent this? Mike, do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I'll try to address it. I mean, there are two factors that would be involved in that at least two factors that would be involved in that conversation if we had such a proposal. One would be relative to the reduction proposal itself or the lower parking requirement. What the approach that we're going to have with this is that, generally speaking, we, if we're lowering the rates, the overall rates for an apartment building, we want to make sure that that new rate is going to be reasonable in the sense that we're not creating problems in neighborhoods by having this lower rate. But if we do encounter a situation where we have an overflow parking issue, there are remedies both on-site and off-site. And there's also some remedies that we are exploring associated with that we don't currently have in a general sense in the ordinance. So, for example, for parking reductions, we have a condition that we typically approve with a parking reduction that says, if there's a parking problem, the owner is obligated to remedy that in some way. And that's something that requires a more formal action by the property owner to work with county staff to remedy that problem. and that would be an on-site remedy to that problem. One of the things that we're talking about is potentially kind of migrating that language as a general ordinance requirement so that, whenever developers build parking, that it becomes their responsibility to manage the parking on site. And if there is a management problem that can't be solved, or that the applicant is unwilling to solve, conceivably, there could be some other actions taken by the county to push that, to push them to resolve the problem. The other element to that is there are unforeseen circumstances in any, even with current development, development that was approved 10, 15, 20 years ago, that because of the way things have changed, that we do have spillover issues. And the county does have a residential permit parking program. There are certain criteria that are involved in implementing it, but we do have permit districts around multifamily communities that have had a significant amount of spillover parking on the local streets, and the community was looking to regulate that, and so these permit districts have been established. So that would be another potential means of resolving a spillover problem by implementing a permit district to address that.
Thanks, Mike. All right. Any other questions? If not, I've shared our link in the chat to the public input survey. Again, this is an exit survey from this town hall. That's about 10 questions, and will greatly help us. DB asks, will more parking garages be encouraged in future development? That's a very good question. I think that it's something we're looking at. And I think parking garages it depends on the location, but I'll let Mike touch on possibility of future developments and more parking garages.
I think part of that's a somewhat, I'll say somewhat vague question, in the sense that I'm not sure what specifically you would be getting at with regard to more parking garages versus surface parking, or more parking in parking garages. I mean, certainly there are opportunities to build a parking. Okay, gotcha. There could be opportunities to build a structured parking garage that would eliminate surface parking. I don't know that the ordinance will necessarily touch upon that as part of this project. And as you probably know, garage parking is very expensive to build, and it also is more expensive to maintain than surface parking. So it's really a circumstance in part where the development is located. Typically, we see more garage parking in higher density developments. So the developer is able to recoup a little bit more of the cost and benefit associated with garage parking. They can maximize the use of their site for other construction, other buildings, that sort of thing. It also, in higher density areas, if you can put the garage underneath the building, then obviously you have space to build a building as well as a garage. In lower density areas, it's less likely that we'll see garage parking, just because of the cost associated with that. There are some sites that have it. I'm thinking like some of the communities, like Greenbrier, or not Greenbrier, but some of the housing communities for older folks. They are building garage parking associated with those projects. So, it could happen in lower density areas, but most of the garage parking, because of cost, will occur in higher density areas.
Thanks for that, Mike. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, like I said, we put the link to our public input survey. We greatly appreciate it if you could take our survey. It'll help with future outreach as well as future possible changes to the ordinance, draft text, things like that. I'll also drop right now again a link to our Parking Reimagined webpage. This webpage is kind of our landing page for this project, and it's where any future opportunities to communicate with us and engage with us will be posted. Those will be posted under upcoming meetings, and in that as well, I would say that just be on the lookout for upcoming events. Our goal is that we will probably be coming back to the Providence district for another type of a town hall. We may even be doing an overall county town hall to talk about parking as a whole. But this is our initial phase, and then next time we come back around, it's very possible that we'll have kind of some more ideas of what we may be changing in draft text to be presented to get some comment on. So thank you so much for your participation tonight. We greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to connecting with you again in the future.
Yes, I want to echo Austin's thanks for participation, and I'm glad that there's been a lot of interest in this project. It's growing within the community, and we definitely are appreciating the input that we're getting and these questions that we are getting in these meetings that we're having, and certainly look forward to having more discussion about this project. So thanks once again, and I wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving.